Okay, my name is Janet Rodriguez, and I'm the founder and CEO of SoHarlem. It's a cultural industry incubator. We're right around the corner in the Mink Building on Amsterdam Avenue in 126. We've been here in the Manhattanville Factory District, that's what this area is called, for 12 years. And I really want to thank Sun Moon for sharing this wonderful space. Our studio now is filled with sewing machines and cutting tables and mannequins, and so we can't do public programs like we used to in that space. And also Esmeralda, who's the program director here at Comunidades, for really helping us pull it all together. And a really big thank you to Deborah Willis. Deborah is the professor and chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, and the director of NYU Center for Black Visual Cultural Studies at the Institute of African American Affairs, and her wonderful colleague, Kira Williams. Before I turn the podium over to Deborah, I really would like to share why this Harlem remembrance of David Driskell is so important. For those of you who knew this creative giant who left a legion of artists, curators, historians, scholars, and entrepreneurs, many who are here with us tonight, you're just living examples of the work and the influence that David had on us. And I appreciate you joining us, especially those that can't be here but are here virtually. I met David in 1985. I was hired as a consultant to Cooper Extud Associates, an architectural planning firm engaged by the Harlem Urban Development Corporation to help design the redevelopment of the Harlem Piers. We agreed that the redevelopment should focus on arts and culture to recognize the significant contributions of people of color, and as an opportunity for Harlem other artists and other residents to have a place about them. I started researching African American scholars who were documenting and giving voice to African Americans, and I found the writings and publications of David Driskell. We reached out to David, and he welcomed us to his Maryland home, and he joined the consulting team of Harlem on the Hudson. We spent the next couple of years visiting places with him that he felt we needed to understand the rich culture of African Americans. While completing my thesis at Columbia on the role of the arts and culture in the redevelopment of Harlem, I was granted permission to take an independent study course with David. So I drove down to Maryland once a week, and I enrolled in David's class where he taught how to make pigments from the earth, flowers, how to make, work with clay. He was just, amazing for me. And I was a minor in painting. So during those weekly trips, I got to know his wonderful family. And I learned a lot about cooking and planting. David shared so many treasures he had in his attic, which needed to be organized, and I began to help him. Later, while I was at the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, I worked with David to bring his collection, Narratives of African American Art and Identity, to the Newark Museum. David always showed up for me during the days at the Schomburg. He showed up during my send-off in Newark after 8 years at the Dodge Foundation. And his speech that day is something I refer to whenever I have any doubts about my destiny. He showed up and encouraged me to open up Straight Outta Harlem, a creative outlet in Sugar Hill, which morphed into SoHarlem, where we exhibited his work, sold his posters, his books, and most of all, he came and spoke to the local community, something he didn't have to do. And most importantly, he showed up as one of my son's godfathers. So I will always treasure the privilege of getting to know David and his family. I thank Davreen and Darius for making the trip up to New York, and hello to the rest of the family, Thelma and Daphne and Eric, and so many of the Driscolls that are watching virtually. And now I'll welcome my dear friend, Deborah Willis.
Thank you. I'm gonna take mine down a bit. It's really a pleasure to see all of you here, and Janet, what you read was so beautiful about David. I keep David so close to my heart every day, and thank you for sharing your dad with me for so many years. I'm really happy to have this experience, to have both Freddy Rodriguez and David Driskell together tonight, based on the fact that we've known their works for so many years and having this opportunity to rethink, rebuild, and reconnect. I wanted to say that we have Pamela Newkirk here to present a moment of David. And David and I, before he entered the hospital, he called me and said, "Be careful." In March, 3 years ago, he was giving me all the advice possibly to be safe and stay safe, because he knows so many stories about me, some fun, some great, some true laughter, that we used to laugh a lot. And the fact is that Harlem was central to him, and having an opportunity to be back in Harlem is an important point. I'd like to first of all thank my colleague, Pamela Newkirk. She is a professor at NYU in journalism. She is unique in many ways because of her voice in journalism, her voice in art history, her voice in history and storytelling. She's written a number of books and challenged us to look at images of people from across the world. She's also asked us to look at letters from journalists, from historians, and she's also asked us to treasure Black love letters, which rarely we see in the 19th century. So she has been a force with me. As she says, I'm always getting her in trouble. What are we going to do this year? We're going to teach a class called Black Paris in May and June. We're also organizing the Black Portraitures Conference in NYU Paris and the Kay Branly, which is May 29th and 30th. And I know all of you will come and join us. And I can see Victor already has your ticket, right? So we're going to do that. But her most recent book is Diversity, Inc., The Failed Promise of a Billion-Dollar Industry. And she has been on the news and had many conversations with a number of people about this experience, about what does diversity mean as a corporation and thinker. Thank you. Let's see. Put it back up there. Thank you. But I also am going to say that if I'm going to ask Devereen, if you'd like to say something after Pamela, I'm going to ask anyone who would like to have a moment to share and reflect about David. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you. It's such an honor to be here today to pay this long overdue tribute, public tribute, to the life and legacy of Dr. David C. Driskell, someone I had the distinct honor and pleasure of knowing for roughly 25 years. I first met him in the late 1990s while working on my thesis at Columbia, like you. And I was looking at what then was called post-Black art. And then I was thrilled in 1999 when he agreed to be interviewed for a profile for Art News, for which I had the privilege to spend real time with him, beginning at his Hyattsville, Maryland home that he shared with his beautiful wife, Thelma. And it was just one of those moments I'll never forget. During the course of my visit, he treated me to he just opened up this treasure trove of African American history, living history. I toured his lovely Victorian house brimming with the work of Black masters, including Elizabeth Catlett, Romare Bearden, Augusta Savage, William T. Williams, that graced the walls, shelves, tabletops, or were cataloged in art cases. Many of these artists had been his friends, teachers, or students who he then inscribed into the canon of art history. Through him, the centuries of African American art sprung to life. He walked me past his bountiful garden of herbs, flowers, and vegetables and climbed the steps to his two-story wood frame studio situated behind his house, where his color-drenched oil paintings abounded. Over a delicious home-cooked meal, food comes up a lot when you're talking about David Driskell. He prepared with the fruits of his garden. He regaled me with stories that trace the contours of his remarkable life, from his humble roots as the son of sharecroppers in Eatonville, Georgia, and the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, to the pinnacle of the international art world. He was inarguably the leading curator, collector, and scholar of art made by Black artists. By the end of his life, he had curated dozens of exhibitions for which he penned countless catalog essays. He had received a National Humanities Medal, more than a dozen honorary degrees, and was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As mentioned earlier, narratives of African American art and identity, the David C. Driskell collection had already been exhibited at the High Museum in Atlanta, which in 2005 established an annual prize bearing his name. It's the first national award that recognizes contributions to African American art. He also has a name center at the University of Maryland, where he was Distinguished Professor Emeritus and had chaired the art department from 1978 to 1983. And while the Art News article that resulted from our many interviews was among hundreds I had written over the course of my career, I treasure his rare letter of gratitude, which I can assure you is uncommon, that conveys his characteristic grace, generosity, and humility. He wrote, "How can I ever thank you for such a fine article? I've been carrying Art News around over the past few days as though it is precious. All who have seen it, including my colleagues, are transfixed by what you wrote," close quote. I could hardly believe that this art world icon, who had granted me a coveted interview, now attributed the positive feedback to my writing rather than to his monumental contribution to the art world. But that was David Driskell, a legend with a common touch, who always showered us with his gentle grace. Over the years, he became a beloved friend whose wisdom, encyclopedic knowledge of Black art, and kindness I came to cherish. I was among the legions who benefited from his largesse, whether it was contributing letters to my book, Letters from Black America, or supporting my other literary and scholarly endeavors. He was an unwavering champion of my work. And despite his demanding schedule, he often found time to drop a line or make an unexpected appearance, as he did during a book talk I gave at the Smithsonian Institute. I was elated to look up and find him in the audience, ever dapper and beaming, and I was humbled and honored when a few years later, during a conference in South Africa organized by DEB, Black Portraitures, he asked me to collaborate with him on the story of his extraordinary life. It's a project that we both regarded as a labor of love that regrettably had only barely begun. The seeds of David Driskell's storied career began at Howard University, where in the early 1950s he studied with the likes of Lois Mailou Jones, Elaine Locke, and James Porter, at the time a leading scholar of African American art. In 1952, during his sophomore year, Porter encouraged him to switch his major from painting to art history. "You have to show people what we contributed," he recalled Porter telling him. It was Porter who introduced him to the work of Aaron Douglas, William H. Johnson, Henry O. Tanner, and other artists whose contributions were not yet firmly established in the field. David was also influenced by Professor James Herring, who founded Howard University's gallery where he had apprenticed. It was Herring who impressed upon him the importance of collecting, cataloging, and curating. In 1953, he received a scholarship to study at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and 2 years later, he graduated from Howard with a BFA. That year, he joined the faculty of Talladega College as an assistant professor, where he remained until 1962, the year he earned an MFA from Catholic University. And in between all this, he was also getting married, having children. While Driskell continued to make his own work and had his first solo exhibition in 1957, he heeded his mentor's advice. Between 1966 and 1977, as chair of the art department and director of the art gallery at Fisk University, he began to meticulously catalog the work of Black artists, providing a scholarly context for their place in art history. At Fisk, he worked closely with Georgia O'Keeffe, who had donated 101 works to the historically Black college during his tenure. As a result of his prodigious scholarship, he was invited to curate the 1972 William H. Johnson retrospective at the National Museum of American Art, which marked a turning point for Johnson's and Driskell's place in the art world. He would go on to curate exhibitions and write catalog essays on dozens of other African-American masters, including Jacob Lawrence, Alma Thomas, and Romare Bearden. He perhaps first came to international prominence in 1976 as curator of the groundbreaking 2 Centuries of Black American Art, 1750 to 1950, at the Los Angeles County Museum. It was an exhibition held during the nation's bicentennial, and he definitively staked out the place of Black artists in the art world over the course of the nation's 200-year history. The exhibition of more than 200 paintings, drawings, and sculpture was the most comprehensive collection of African-American art ever assembled and displayed at a major museum. It traveled across the country, and the catalog came to define the canon, and it remains a seminal text for students, scholars, curators, and collectors of Black art the world over. It was Driskell who curated the private collections of the likes of Bill Cosby and Oprah Winfrey, and who in 1995 was invited by President Clinton to select the first work of art by an African American to be purchased and permanently displayed at the White House. He chose Sunset Atlantic City by Henry O. Tanner. Meanwhile, this son of a Baptist minister continued to create his own lush, color-drenched oil and gouache paintings, collages, and prints, many inspired by biblical stories, African tribal art, and nature. Echoes, the art of David C. Driskell, 1955 to 1997, toured the country in 2000, and in the months before his untimely passing, he was excited about plans for a retrospective of his work scheduled to open at the High Museum in Atlanta. "Lord willing," he wrote, "it will be on the occasion of my 90th, spring 2021. And while David would not live to see his 90th birthday that spring, Icons of Nature and History, a survey of his work featuring 50 paintings, collages, prints, and drawings spanning 6 decades, were posthumously exhibited at the Venerable Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., where he had been a trustee. The exhibition was co-organized by the High Museum of Art and the Portland Museum of Art and billed as the first comprehensive examination of his work. The exhibition catalog described his legacy in the history of American art as quote unquote unparalleled. It continued, through his curatorial work, writing, and teaching, he demonstrated that the art of Black people is essential to the story of American art. But his contribution to the world of art was rivaled by his outsized humanity and his gentle and generous spirit. He was a true Renaissance man whose love of nature, gardening, quilting, and beauty defined him. Deeply spiritual, he was ever steeped in gratitude for the wondrous life he seemed destined to live. Quote, "If I had to do it over again, I would," he told me in 1999. Art is a priestly calling. It's the kind of visual mobility that shows us life can be so beautiful. I've been blessed to have this happen to me. There's no way to sum up the manifold qualities that added up to David Driskell. We each hold our unique memories that help fill the void of his absence. For some, it's the memory of the homemade preserves he'd send over the holidays. For others, it's his appearance at an opening or a letter of recommendation or one of the witty stories he shared. As I wrote in Art News following his passing, quote, "I reveled in his erudite lectures peppered with anecdotes about art world legends, his stories of travel he chronicled in journals chock full of vibrant sketches, and the colorful email he dashed off from cities around the world." And I also marveled at his boundless energy, the way well into his 80s he crisscrossed the globe, still in demand as a lecturer, curator, and consultant, even as he longed to return to what he called his garden paradise in Maine. His was a life of service and honor, and to the end, he was duty-bound to his singular calling. Wrapped in one elegant package was an incomparable artist, curator, okay, I'm gonna get through this, collector, scholar, and beloved teacher, mentor, father, husband, and friend, who left an indelible mark on the world of art and on our hearts. I'll close with these fitting words by Maya Angelou. "When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder. Lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall, in forests, small things recoil into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly, our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid, promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality bound to them takes leave of us. Our souls dependent upon their nurture now shrink, wizened. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. We are not so much maddened as reduced to an unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always irregularly. Spaces filled with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses restored, never to be the same, whisper to us, they existed, we can be and be better, for they existed. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you. You know, no, come up. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She's always getting me into trouble now.
Just wanted to ask if anyone had questions about this wonderful paper you presented, wonder moments and words, celebration. Anyone?
So I first just want to thank everyone who took the time out of their busy day to come here for this wonderful event. A dear friend, family, my son who's here. And I just want to say that first and foremost, David Driskell was a father, a parent. He was a man who put his family first. And when sometimes I'm asked, what did it feel like to be the daughter of a world-renowned artist? I would say, well, I never took a course from him at Fisk University. So if that answers your question. But actually, we were raised in the culture. And it was nothing to go to the National Gallery of Art on Sunday and to walk through. And he would talk about the different aspects of arts. So yes, our father, he embraced the African American culture, but he also taught us that it was a way of life. And we're so privileged that our father taught us that the beauty of art is seen in those who behold it. So once again, thank you.
I got to know David Driskell at Fisk University, and I had come as a junior. I transferred from Western Michigan University, which is about 30,000 students, majority white, where in our department there were like 2 black people. So I arrived in Nashville and walked up to Ballantyne Hall the first day to meet him. And I remember going into his office, and he was just this dapper man, and who welcomed me in open arms. And the art department was like a family. And Daberine, Mrs. D, and Aaron Douglas was there, Martin Perrier, Bobby Senstack, Earl Hooks, Stephanie Pogue. So this incredible amount of people. And the people like Alma Thomas, all these people came, I had a work-study job at the gallery at Van Vechten with David. And so I got to learn a lot with the Steelers collection and everything. And I remember, like the classes, he was teaching from his friends. He was making a curriculum right then. And I didn't realize many years later how important it was and how groundbreaking it was. I remember later when I moved to New York and my friend Maria, we went to the opening of 2 Centuries at the Brooklyn Museum. And I was very green to the New York art scene. And we got there and Maria said, this is a big damn deal. But I've been learning all this stuff already, so I didn't really think of it in that way. But the family, I've known David since then. I always went to Maine. They welcomed me. I got exposed to Maine, which I love now. But it's interesting now that I see a lot of how important he was to Black American art history. and the artist. And now there's a lot of young artists who are very good, but they think Black art history began with Basquiat, so. But I just want to say it was an incredible honor to be his friend, his student, and the Driscolls, and I love you guys. Thank you.
I mean, he's inherited such a big job, which is protecting his father's legacy, his grandfather, and I just can't begin to imagine what that must be like. So I'm sure he's still processing all of it himself, but know that if you want to share anything, you are more than welcome. Anyone else have any David Driskell? If not, I'm gonna move on to Alejandro. So last year, when SoHarlem was in residence at the Malt House, which is the building next door on the street level, we had a series of public programs, and one of them was supposed to be on Dominican artists. It was called "Can We Talk About Dominican Artists?" Because we don't normally do that. And Alejandro Anreus was going to lead the discussion, but then we lost our leading Dominican artist, Freddy Rodriguez. He was a friend, he was a colleague. I have this range of memories from him deciding that he was gonna get into the cigar business in the Dominican Republic and make cigars. They were actually quite good. They had a vanilla kind of taste to them. And then seeing him a couple of years later, and he says, "Oh no, I'm a painter. I'm not a cigar entrepreneur." But they were good. And then one day he talked me into going with him to the Hispanic Society, which was a long time ago, and it scared the hell out of me, the place, because it had been closed and dark for so long, but he saw the potential of what it could be. And I thank him for that, because I think if you look at the Hispanic Society today, it has made a 180-degree shift, and it is an incredible place. The impact of Freddie's loss, particularly during a time where we've lost so many people, had a real impact on Alejandro, obviously, who was a very close friend of his, and we decided it would be best to wait until the spring, when Alejandro could talk and be in a better place about it. So that brings me to Alejandro, another person that I have known for about, I think it's 30 years. Mas, 30 years, and what he has exposed me to in the art world, from the exhibitions to the books to the just the writings and the people he finds and he writes about and he cares about and he's so passionate about, and I'm not gonna lie, I can't even read half of his books. They're just way above my head. But what I love about Alejandro is that he made a concerted effort to work with an organization on the West Coast, AVEL, to really ensure that the work of Caribbean artists is documented, not just documented, but used as a curriculum in higher education. And that's really, to me, that was very major, and it was something I loved working on, and I'm forever grateful to him for. So I could go on about Alejandro, but I really want you to hear. I want you to hear from him. And come, Alejandro.
Buenas noches. See, you guys know. Well, the previous speaker has given me permission to already start crying. So I'm going to do my best to hold my shit together. First, I want to thank mi hermana Janet and Dr. Willis, and I want to acknowledge both Mary and Aaron, Freddie's wife, and his oldest daughter, Dr. Rodriguez, for being here with us tonight. So I want to begin with an epigraph that he loved, and I loved, and another friend of ours loves. And it's by J.M. Coetzee. It is indeed so hard to say anything of interest about friendship. Then a further insight becomes possible that, unlike love or politics, which are never what they seem, friendship is what it seems to be. Friendship is transparent. There he is. A week ago, my wife told me I had to get a haircut, trim the beard, and get a new jacket because I was speaking about Freddie. My son even told me I had to wear one of these, which I never do, because I was speaking about Freddie. Because you can see, as Ileana Emilia and I were saying earlier, look at those wonderful two-tone shoes. I always loved those two-tone shoes. Freddie was a real gentleman from the Caribbean because he knew that when you got up in the morning and you left your house, no matter where you lived, that you were a work of art. He knew that it was about how you dressed, it was about how you walked, it was about how you talked, and it was about how you danced. I knew of Freddie's work since the late 1970s and early 1980s, when I first encountered it in the legendary Cayman Gallery in Soho. I recall an installation that confused me, as well as abstractions that evoked erotic encounters. I learned that he was Dominican-born, a New Yorker by choice, and an extraordinary painter who was not afraid to experiment with other mediums and genres. I finally met him in person at the opening of his solo exhibition at the also legendary and much missed Algira in Newark in 1993. He was accompanied by his wife Mary and daughters Erin and Caitlin. I liked the fact that he was there with his family, that he immediately spoke to me in Spanish, and that he once again had these extraordinary paintings from the Vienen por las Islas series, which overwhelmed me with their formal beauty and profound content. He invited me right away to visit his studio, and I jokingly replied that I would be happy to, as I was leaving indentured servitude as a curator at the Montclair Art Museum, if you want to talk about white privilege, and starting a new job as a curator at the Jersey City Museum on the top floor of the Jersey City Public Library building. Barely a month into my new job, I received an envelope, which I still treasure, with handwritten instructions of how to drive from New Jersey to 3512 162nd Street, Flushing, Queens. Do not go through Staten Island, he wrote. Little did I know that it was the beginning of a wonderful adventure that would last almost 30 years. What began as a professional relationship between artist and curator quickly developed into a friendship. As he would tell me over and over, una verdadera amistad. Something so rare in an art world so filled with only transactions. That initial visit bore fruit almost immediately. In 1995, in the Jersey City Museum's smallest gallery, we exhibited Priests, the Spirit and the Flesh, a group of paintings where Freddie, once again, was way ahead of everyone else, making rigorously abstract paintings dealing with the sexual abuse scandals in the church, the abnormality of a celibate all-male clergy, and the fact that spirituality was sensual and sexual. It was just extraordinary. And then in 1999, just 2 years before my departure from the museum, we collaborated on En Esta Casa Trujillo es el Jefe, an extraordinary body of works from 1990-91 that are a gorgeous meditation on the power of painting and a dismantling of the horrors of the Trujillo regime, its afterlife in the Balaguer years, and its origins in Latin American and Spanish caudillismo overall. This exhibition traveled under the sponsorship of Brugal Rum to the Museo de Arte Moderno in Santo Domingo and to the Pontifical University in Freddy's native Santiago de los Caballeros. Since the start of the friendship, Freddy would always bring up, and this why this image is up, what he considered to be the most important elements in his life. He would say the ones that marked him, the ones that mattered. And he would say, en orden cronológico, in chronological order. Being born in the Caribbean under a dictatorship, coming to New York City as a teenager, knowing he was going to be an artist, and meeting and marrying Mary McKenna, and becoming the father of Aaron and Caitlin. Everything else was possible, he would say, because it was grounded in these realities. Freddy was born in Santiago de los Caballeros on December 1st, 1945. His great uncle was the Dominican painter Georgie Morel. He was raised by his mother, Juana Estela Rodriguez, and his Spanish stepfather, Foro Rodriguez. His sister, the late Evelyn Morel, was 13 years younger than him. He would tell me that since he was practically an infant, he was cognizant of the presence of El Jefe, Trujillo, in all aspects of Dominican life, while simultaneously at home his stepfather spoke critically of Trujillo and his then Spanish equivalent, Francisco Franco. One of the aspects of Freddy that always engaged me was his curiosity, his joy about all aspects of the arts, the visual, the literary, the musical, popular music, boleros, huarachas, jazz, classical. Joking on our mutual Catholic culture, he will bring up the Holy Trinity that most affected him. And he would say, Mondrian, Coltrane, and Julio Cortázar, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. For Freddy, these three larger-than-life figures represented open-ended experimentation, rejection of repetition, joy in expression. I can hear him, and this I took right from my journals, because I would spend a day with him and then I would go home and write about it. And I'm quoting, "From my favorite things to a love supreme, the guy's just constantly growing, expanding, breaking things down, and inventing new sounds. And all this before he died at 40, carajo." End of quote. And of course, Mondrian was all about painting, the vitality of painting in and of itself, the sensuality of paint as structure. One of the most privileged things that I will always treasure in my life is having been to the Museum of Modern Art at least 5 times in the past 30 years with him, going gallery to gallery, stopping, looking, commenting, laughing, being irreverent. Growth, expansion, breaking down and inventing all of it with curiosity and joy. I would say that these are essential elements in all of Freddy's art. Cortázar's importance in Freddy's self-knowledge and creative process cannot be overstated. He assured me many times over the years that El Cronopio Mayor was probably the deepest influence on his aesthetic. The Argentinian writer did not believe that any two of his books should be similar. Freddy did not believe in pictorial repetition through his series. And of course, they also shared the consistency of vision while altering and experimenting with form. That vision, for both of them, was grounded in a humanism that was playful, irreverent, critical, rooted in the margins of history, the voices and sights of the outsiders, be this born in the Caribbean or Argentinian exiles or any kind of exiles. Freddy was an intense and lifelong student, zeroing in on Rembrandt and Cézanne at the Met, his lessons with Preston Dickinson at the Art Students League of New York and with Carmen Cicero at the New School, looking at Matisse and Rothko at MoMA, at Motherwell's collages and Carmen Herrera's geometries in the galleries, the color and composition of Jacob Lawrence and Romare Bearden at the Whitney and other New York galleries. And of course, the art of his place of birth, from his great uncle Georgi Morel to the experimentations of Dario Suro. Another significant example for Freddy was the work of two artists who were only about a decade older than him. And these were Melvin Edwards and Jack Whitten. He would say to me that what was important about their work for him is that you could reflect on your roots. You could explore your identity. You could comment on history and society while working in abstraction. That abstraction was not meant to be contentless, that was an invention of the critics of the New York School. I love these pictures of him with that afro in the Soho warehouse. I think they're so cool. In the 70s, he would transform minimalist abstraction into a language charged with intense color and a narrative that referenced Taino, Siboney, and African elements, and the troubled history of the Caribbean. By the early 80s, he would shift to an organic abstraction that reflected nature and emotions through symbols. And for example, the painting Inferno, he would tell me that was the painting where he realized he would eventually need to deal with the Trujillo dictatorship through an abstract imagery. In 1986-88, the extraordinary Cimarrón series, which are those of you who are not Spanish speakers, that means runaway slave. He read Miguel Barnett's Biografía de un Cimarrón, which then, typical Freddy manner, led him to research and study slavery, the slave trades, slave rebellions, and escapes throughout the Caribbean. And then, of course, in 1990-91, en esta casa, Trujillo es el jefe. Wow. I will tell you what an old Cuban artist that admired him greatly, Roberto Estopiñán, said when he went to see the exhibition at the Jersey City Museum. He spoke no English, so you'll have to figure it out what I'm saying. He said, cojones, esto es pintura. In 1991-92, of course, Vienen por las Islas, his meditation on the quincentenary, a dialogue of geometry and nature, a repositioning of traditional Christian symbols, and Native American iconography. And of course, his extraordinary inventiveness with materials in this series. These are three pieces that once belonged to the Jersey City Museum that currently are in the Zimmerli Museum. Casabe y Cruz. There are paintings on casabe that have then been densely prepared with acrylic. Okay. The Vestment series, 95 through 1997, grounded in intense reading on church history, on pedophilia scandals, on the patriarchal priesthood, and the great paradox of a religion charged with sensuality and at the same time repression and abuse. And I think here you see a pattern which I think is important. And he said to me that he believed it was very important to really get deeply into a subject and research it in depth, okay? And I said to him, how did you come about this? And he said, well, my love of literature, first of all. But then he said to me, you know who did that? And I said, well, can I guess? He said, no, I'm going to tell you who did that. He said, Jacob Lawrence did that. With the Harriet Tubman series in 39, with the Migration series in 40-41. So I'm saying this to you because Freddy, like the majority of Latino artists, feels a great kinship and connection with African American art and culture. Because of course, he and I would always joke, and I do this also with Mel Edwards and Juan Sanchez. We have a phrase in Spanish very typical of the Caribbean, which is, el que no tiene de Congo, tiene de Carabalí, okay? Which means that we're all African if we're from the Caribbean. 1999, 2000, he was enraged after going to a panel where a then major figure among a curator critic group, or whatever the hell they're called these days, had said that, well, Latino artists cannot do abstraction. Latino artists can only do social figuration. I hear him, ¿Qué vaina es esa? And so he produces the series Political Statements, 1999 to 2000. His reply to these critics, curators, and even some collectors that on the one hand wanted to depoliticize abstraction or demand that Latino artists must only be figurative and social. And I should tell that when he was doing these paintings, he told me that once again, he had started listening to Coltrane, and he had started listening to Monk. And so we talked about the sound between the sound, right? The notes between the notes, and of course, the space between the spaces, right? Of course, only Freddy could have been the artist who designed the Flight 587 Memorial Monument in Rockaway Beach. It is breathtaking. It is extraordinarily simple. And because of that, it is profoundly mournful. And then, of course, la pelota, right? Baseball. What does it mean? Is it about empowerment? Or is it about cooptation? How do you take the language of pop art and transform it into a vocabulary that can make us question certain things about stereotypes, about power, and about the capitalism of sports, right? He, of course, had to celebrate the centennial of Cortázar. So in 2013, 2014, he did paintings, a marvelous artist book, installations, all in homage to Cortázar. And we both talked about the possibility of doing a big exhibition and involving a 24-hour marathon of reading out loud Cortázar's works. And unfortunately, it did not come to pass. And then you see a painting like this, and it's extraordinary. La gran paradoja es asomarse a la locura sin estar loco. Julio Cortázar. The great paradox is to look into insanity without being insane.
Yeah.
And I think I just made my son happy because that was his favorite painting by Freddy. He did these magnificent temporary murals at the Sugar Hill Children's Museum. And so, once again, he takes the language of minimalism and he endows it with meaning. And it's not just about the forms. It's not just about the surface or the color. But it is who has made this painting? Where has this painting been made? What does this painting tell us about who we are and where we are? And then his last major series, The History of Gold, which was connected to his time as an artist, scholar, in residence at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. And I'm sure both Dr. Carmen Ramos, who honors us with her presence, remembers that, and Dr. Olga Herrera, and her husband Carlos, who spent a lot of time with Freddy during that time in Washington, D.C. But of course, this entire body of work is about painting. And I think Freddy would be very pissed off at me if I didn't say that. Painting and its endless possibilities, reinventions, and redefinitions. Excuse me a moment. When my daughter was about 12, she told me one day that she realized that I was part of a tribe. And I said, what do you mean a tribe? He said, yeah, it's a tribe. You know, these people that you're always with, that they're like your family. And I said, really? He said to me, yeah. Well, who are these people? She said to me, you know, Freddie and Mel and Juan and John Quick to see Smith and Gloria. And so I just want to share with you some tribal pictures. And of course, in many of these, those gatherings took place at SoHarlem, and the reason you don't see mi hermana Janet is because she was taking these pictures. There you have Freddie, another person we miss a lot, Adal. That good-looking guy with no hair was me years ago, and of course Juan. I love that photo of Freddie in the studio, and of course with Mayor de Blasio at the monument. These two wonderful photographs of Freddie and Mary and Freddie in the studio taken by Juan Giraldo, who's also here tonight, and one of my old-time favorites of tribes, the opening of the Jersey City Museum in October of 2001. And you're looking at Mel Edwards, Rocio Aranda, the late Shiva Sharo, Juan Sanchez, Joan Cook to Smith, who, by the way, her major retrospective at the age of 82 opens at the Whitney next week. It's about fucking time. Freddie, Janet Taylor Pickett, Roberto Estopiñán, who said that the pinturas from En esta casa tus ríos el jefe has a lot of cojones. He's also gone. The late Peter Hamitsky, and then me. But of course, these two photos of Freddie, I think, are wonderful because it shows you in his studio, and it shows you with, of course, the great love of his life. But I want you to pay attention to the scarf, because this is Freddie. Freddie could get away with that shit because he had this innate sense of elegance about him. More tribal pictures. Deborah Cullen, Carmen Ramos, Gloria. I love that picture of Freddie and Juan laughing on the lower right of the screen. And of course, I had gone to Mexico and I had brought him a critical edition of Rayuela by Cortázar, and it had a wrapping. And he took the wrapping and he painted over it. And he then made a sign. It says, hay que leer a Cortázar. We must read Cortázar. Painting, a work from the series Rayuela, the painting Rayuela, Freddie in the studio, with my son, with Juan, Susana Leval, Julia Hertzberg. And then that picture in the corner was the last visit we made to Freddie. And of course, there's Sherizade Garcia, and Ilan Emilia, and Mary and Freddie and Carmen, and my son David and my wife Debbie. So I want you to look at this painting as I read something to you. This is the logical steps from the Cimarron series. Because a man, an artist like Freddie, is a cimarron who exercises his freedom and defines himself against the currents of Caribbean history, New York City alienation, and an ignorant art world. He knew who he was and what he had to do and did it, as he would always remind me, with the love and support of Mary and his daughters. One of the times that I visited Freddie, he, of course, always encouraged me in my closeted life as a poet in the Spanish language. And so he gave me a fragment of a poem, and he said, lee esto. Todos debemos aspirar a esto. Read this. We should all aspire to be this. So I'm going to read it to you in Spanish, and then I'm going to give you a very quick translation into English. And it's a fragment of a poem by the great Pedro Mir, the national poet of the Dominican Republic. It's a poem called, and it's interesting that you read Maya Angelou talking about trees, great trees, and this is called Sobre los Árboles, about trees. El mundo necesita hombres y mujeres que sean como los árboles en el Caribe, donde la tierra es Siboney, Taína, y las raíces África, y el tronco España. Y las ramas somos nosotros, que crecemos y tocamos el aire, y bailamos en la brisa, y resistimos los huracanes. Benditos sean los hombres y mujeres que son como los árboles, que nos enseñan a estar en el mundo y vivir la vida. Thank you, Freddie. John just reminded me I have to translate the poem, sorry. I was surprised that my two children didn't go, subtitles, Papi, subtitles. The world needs men and women that are like trees, like the trees in the Caribbean, where the earth is Siboney, Taína, and the roots are Africa, and the trunk is Spain, and we are the branches that grow and touch the air and dance in the breeze and resist the hurricanes. Blessed be the men and women that are like trees, that teach us to be in the world, to live life. Freddie definitely was a tree. Thank you. So I don't want to embarrass her, but I would like to ask my dear friend, Dr. Carmen Ramos, who, by the way, is writing what will be a great monograph on Freddie for the Aver series that Janet mentioned before. And I just want to tell you something before I introduce Dr. Ramos. And Chon Noriega gathered a bunch of scholars from all over the country to propose the artists that we needed to look at for this series of Aver and to get involved with the curriculum in schools, make sure oral histories took place, etc. And so I went around the room. The room had 6 Chicano scholars, 2 Puerto Rican scholars, and 1 Cuban. I should add working class from Elizabeth, New Jersey. So they're going around the room, and when it's time for the Cuban to speak, which was me, I said, well, I think there's 3 artists that need monographs right away. Freddy Rodriguez, Juan Sanchez, and Maria Brito. And a so-called leading scholar of Latin American art who sat across the table from me said, are you Dominican? And I said, why? Do you have a problem with me being Dominican? I said to her, I would be happy to be Dominican. And from that moment on, Chon Noriega always refers to me as Dr. Alejandro Anreus, the virtual Dominican. But the real Dominican, born and bred in New York, and of course, great curator at the Newark Museum, a great curator at the Smithsonian, transformed the collection of the Smithsonian in the time she was there. And of course, is now the chief conservation officer and curator of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., Dr. Carmen Ramos.
Thank you, Alejandro. It's hard to follow that history that you shared with us of your friendship and your work with Freddie. I don't have any prepared remarks, but I've known Freddie for a very, very long time, and I think, Alejandro, you were the one that introduced me to him when I was in graduate school in the 1990s. And I wanted to meet him in part because of what Janet was talking about how absent Dominican-American artists are from our knowledge of Latinx art history. And being Dominican-American, I was always very aware of that absence and always wanted to fill it up, right? And to do something to make artists known and present in that history, part of multiple art histories, because it was a history that was marginalized even from Latinx art history and American art history and Latin American art history. It was just absent everywhere you turned. So Freddie was one of the first artists that I met in my quest to understand the work of Dominican-American artists. And I've always referred to him as the dean, because he was so important. There were artists that came before, Dario Suro, obviously, was in the United States since the 1950s, I believe. But Freddy was, because he came as a teenager, he incurred his entire artistic education in the United States. He really embodied that space called being Dominican American or being a Dominican New Yorker. In fact, I wrote a paper once that I presented at Latino Art Now, titled "The First Dominican New York Artist," because he was the first in embodying all the complexities of what that is, right? That feeling of being part of a U.S. tradition, of being very grounded in the history of American art, which he totally was, because his exposure was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because his exposure was at MoMA, right? He knew those collections in a very, very deep way, and I know that from studying his work and from our conversations. But he really embodied all those complexities, and I've had many discussions with him, interviews with him, in my work for the monograph, but even before and after that, just many discussions where I really understood the complexity of his relationship to both the United States and the Dominican Republic, right? It wasn't an easy relationship in either camp, right? And I hope that my work could kind of explore that and really present the depth of his work. And today, in addition to the monograph, the National Gallery is I'm working on an exhibition of Freddy's work for the National Gallery, and I'm super excited about it. And one of the things that I was doing today was I'd spoken to Freddy over many years, and I knew that Larry Aldrich in the 1970s had acquired a painting by Freddy for his collection. This was before the Aldrich Museum. And in the 1990s, they deaccessioned it and gave it to the Bronx Museum. And I'd spoken to Freddy about this many times. He's like, oh yeah, this painting's in the Bronx Museum collection. I was like, okay, yeah, I have to go see it. And now that I'm working on the exhibition, I was like, let me go see this painting, right? So today, I went to see the painting. I was texting with Isabella about it, and it was just amazing. It was just an amazing painting from 1971, and it's titled Cuando lo vi, so when I saw him, or when I saw him, and it is from the 1970s, early 70s, when Freddy was beginning to transition from titling his paintings untitled to giving them Spanish titles, right? And he often spoke about how his work was about identity, and he was always saying, I was putting my identity in the paintings, right? And I'm really, now that I've written a lot about Freddy, and I've thought a lot about his work, but now that I'm working on the exhibition and the monograph, I'm just taking things slower, and I'm really looking at things and really reading things and just kind of slowing down a bit. And I'm just understanding that a bit more, like what he meant by putting his identity in his work. It wasn't that you could see the painting from a mile away and say, oh yeah, that's by a Dominican American artist. He has these references, but it's deeper than that, right? It's about his life. It's about his experiences of migration. He would say many things to me, and I'm so grateful for our conversations. And there are certain phrases and statements that I just have recorded. I could almost hear him saying them to me. And one of them is that geometry saved his life. That's how he phrased it, that the discipline of being a geometric abstractionist really allowed him to stay focused, to be productive in the midst of being drafted for the Vietnam War, right? A war that he didn't believe in, a war that he dodged, of giving him the foundation to survive the loss of his mother, a year after he arrives in the United States. So really difficult experiences that he had. And his intellect, his focus gave him the power to get through those experiences, And that's part of what he meant about his identity being in his art, right? So it's just much deeper than just what you would think on the surface. And so this painting that I saw today, it just really was beautiful. It really surprised me. The color surprised me. It was a square painting that the colors are black, brown, blue, like a sky blue, and a kind of khaki ochre. So super unusual colors in the context of hard edge painting, like just very, and Freddy was very unusual in his color choices. He studied at the Fashion Institute of Technology, so he studied color theory, and looking at this painting, all these ideas came to mind. Rembrandt came to mind because the brown was kind of like the brown of Rembrandt, that dark brown color. I started thinking of Joseph Albers because the painting was square, and it was all these kind of rectangular shapes within this square format. So I saw him dialoguing with Joseph Albers. I saw Rothko in the painting because of the way that he painted these shapes and the way you could, in some areas, see his brushstrokes. So it was just so deep to see the work and to discover it. And that's what I was talking to Isabella about, just the rediscovery of his work as I'm working on this. We acquired one of the paintings that you saw here, Paradise for a Tourist Brochure. And when I went back to look at that after not having seen it for a long time, it was also fascinating to see his use of collage. And I was talking to a scholar about this week, in fact. I was saying, Freddy just didn't say, just give me that newspaper and I'm just gonna collage it on here. No. Every piece of paper that was collaged was specifically selected, right? Because of what it had. It was that content. It was just very deliberate. Everything was very deliberate, a very intellectual approach. So in many ways, while we call Freddy a painter, a mixed media artist, he was really a conceptual artist, because he was thinking about concepts and really thinking about how he's gonna relay that to his audiences. So, I just feel really honored to have been, Alejandro and I would say are the closest scholars to him. And I just feel so honored to be one of those people. I have to say, I really feel just special, that I'm a special person because I was able to spend so much time with him, that I have his memories, that I could share those with the public is something that I really treasure. Thank you.
Hello. Good evening to all. There's so much that I can say about Freddy, but I think the most important thing that I want to say is what a loving and loved man that he was. I am so glad that I actually know quite a few of you here in the audience this evening, and it's all because they're all fans and dear friends of Freddy's. When Freddy and I ended up looking back at sort of our old phone books, we realized that we had known each other actually for far longer than we'd realized, or we had sort of orbited in each other's circles but never actually met each other. I started my career at Sotheby's. So I was in the Latin American department then, and Freddy used to come to our receptions. But anyway, there were always these big celebrations, so we were maybe vaguely familiar with one another. But it wasn't until an exhibition at the Museo del Barrio, The Elusive Eye, where Freddy's work, his beautiful painting was hanging, And a friend of mine, Laura Blanco, said, "Ooh, you have to come and meet Freddie. He's here. He's one of the artists who's here in person at the opening." And we went over and chatted. And so they said, "Well, do you want to come and visit my studio?" And so Laura and I went, and she drove out, and we met him and chatted with him and looked at the paintings at his house. And this started this kind of friendship where Laura, Freddie, and I would meet every few months to have lunch and talk about projects and speak about art. And then Freddie and I continued the conversation. At the time, I just had an office. I was a private dealer at that point. And one day, Freddie said, "You know, I really want you to represent me." And I said, "But Freddie, I'm not a gallery. I'm a private dealer. I've never worked at a gallery." And he said, No. Well, anyway, we left that. Next time we met again, he said, "I want you to represent me." And I said, "But Freddie, you know I don't have a gallery." And he said, "I know, but I trust you." And so Freddie changed my life, because little by little, this caused me to then open up a gallery, which is called Hutchinson Modern Contemporary. And my opening show was Freddie's work. And it was right smack in the middle of the pandemic, October 2020. And I have to thank my husband, who's seated here too, who watched me through this whole adventure and was very, very fond of Freddie, because Freddie was so likable. So I opened up the exhibition, and it was incredible to see who responded to the work and how they responded. And in the day when we started unpacking the paintings and seeing them hanging in this space and realizing the incredible quality. Freddie's paintings were all pristine. He took care of them, loved them, knew every last detail about every piece. He has this black binder of slides with all the facts. I mean, he was so organized. So anyway, I represent Freddie's work. I have to say I've been so proud to be part of sort of the journey of having people understand who he was in greater depth and have people respond just to the beauty of the work in addition to the power of it, of what he was saying. And he always said at the end of the day, he was a colorist, and that beauty was so important. Anyway, he treated me always with such kindness, and I'm so glad to know Mary, Aaron, now you, meeting you in person the first time this evening. But it's been a great privilege, and I have to thank him for what he brought to my life and what I hope to continue bringing, to his legacy as more and more people get to know him and his work. Anyway, thank you all.
Real world for me, I have 2 little granddaughters, and they're with my husband, so I have to leave. But I just want to say thank you for this gathering. It's just a wonderful exchange. The ending with Pamela, the poems that you didn't even connect with each other, and you connected, but the idea working with Janet on this was central. I mean, we see the similarities of work, we see the influences. When you said you're honored to be in his life, I'm honored, as Janet is, in all of us, in terms of honored to be in this room. And so thank you, and I'll talk later. Okay, take care. Okay.
I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments or anything they would like to add before we wrap it up. But I really want to thank you for coming. And one of the things I do want to point out is when we were putting together this program, I kept getting calls or inquiries or questions. Are you going to be exhibiting his work or their work? I said, no, this is really, a time to remember him, to remember David, to remember Freddie. And I think we have enough museums and galleries in New York City, and that is their job. And I do hope, we even have one in Harlem, and I do hope that they are the ones that take this, these 2 incredible artists. And I thank Carmen for doing an exhibit coming up, but that's DC, which is just as important. But I do think, the time is right for giving Freddie and, David, with no question, the kind of retrospects that they have not had. Thank you.